Hello, and welcome to Pelts, Skulls, and Tracks. This is a identification video to help you with learning about the mammals that are going to be found in our 4-H wildlife judging contest. Let's get started. When you're looking at skulls, there's a few areas you really want to focus on. The eye placement, teeth, and the size. And those are labeled here with the arrows. Eye placement. When we think about looking at a skull for identification, when the eyes face front, the animal hunts. So you want to think about that animal as being one of your predator species. If the eyes are facing the sides, the animal hides. And you can see here that this animal has an eye that would probably be on the side, indicating that this is more of a prey species. When you look at the teeth, you want to look at the incisors, which are the front teeth, and the molars, which are the back or the grinding teeth. Are they smooth and used for cutting and grinding of plants? Or are they more pointed and used for tearing meat? If you look at the incisors here, they're relatively flat. The molars are relatively flat, so we could tell from this skull that this animal is more of a plant eater versus a meat eater. And finally, you want to look at the size of the skull. It's going to be relative to the size of the animal. This skull here measures almost 11 inches, so we know that by base the size of the skull, we're looking at a larger animal. Let's compare these two skulls. The skull on the left, the eyes are on the side, the incisors are flatter, and the molars are more square. The skull is about 3 inches long. This skull tells us that the animal hides or is a prey species, and also the animal is probably an herbivore and relatively small. If we look at the skull on the right, the eyes are facing forward. The incisors are more pointed, and the molars are also more pointed. The skull is almost 7 inches long. By looking at those teeth, we can tell that this animal is probably a predator. It's a carnivore. Look at those sharp teeth for tearing meat, and the animal is relatively large. So the skull on the left is our eastern cottontail, and the skull on the right is a coyote. Once you know what the skulls actually are, it helps with the characteristics as well. Let's look at the tracks now. The track on the left has webbing between the toes and tells us that the animal lives in water. You can see that the track is quite large, longer than 4 inches long. The track on the right has well-defined toes and tells us that the animal is more suited for climbing. That track is also around 4 inches long. So as you look at these two tracks, the track on the left is our American beaver, and we know from studying that the beaver does live in a more aquatic habitat. And the track on the right is our raccoon, and we know that raccoons are quite adept at climbing and gripping things, and so the tracks can tell us a lot about the animals as well. When you're studying the tracks, usually the track is of the hind feet because of the way the animal's movement is. It's easier to kind of capture those tracks that way. Let's look at some scat. We don't have scat very often in our contest, but let's talk about it just so if you come across a picture of scat, you'll understand. Scat is another name for animal waste or their droppings. And if you look at the scat on the left, it's more rounded and pelleted. That tells us that the animal's diet is primarily plants, so the animal is probably an herbivore. The scat on the right is longer and not clearly any defined shape. Kind of looks like dog poop, to be honest, right? And this tells us that the animal's diet is primarily meat, maybe with some plants, so that animal is either a carnivore or an omnivore. The scat on the left is eastern cottontail. And we know that from the small size and the rounded shapes, that makes sense because cottontails are herbivores. The scat on the right is fox. Foxes are omnivores, so they'll eat many different types of foods. And the shape makes sense because of the diet of the fox. So let's get started with some of our animals that we have to identify this year. Up first is American beaver. Let's look at the pelt of the American beaver. It's quite large. You can see from the ruler there that this pelt is around 30 inches long. The best way I can describe the American beaver pelt to you is it looks like a giant puddle. The beaver pelt is rounded in shape when it's tanned and laid out like this. The beaver has two coats, meaning that the top coat is more slick, feels more water repellent, and the undercoat, if you were to kind of run your fingers through the beaver's fur, the undercoat would be more fluffy and feels more warm. So think about your winter coat that maybe has an outer shell that repels the rain and the snow, but the inside of it is kind of fuzzy and warm. That's the way the beaver's pelt would feel. The beaver skull is quite large, up to around 5 inches. You'll notice the shape is kind of a triangle wedge shape. The large incisors, beavers are rodents, so their teeth do not ever stop growing. And you can see the molars of the beaver are flat for more grinding, and we know that from the diet of the beaver. So that large angular skull is a identifying characteristic of the beaver. And then once again, there's the beaver track that we used as the example in the beginning. A little over 4 inches, very kind of wide set, webbed feet because of the aquatic habitat that the beaver lives in. Up next, let's look at the bobcat. Now, bobcat's going to be pretty easy to identify. It looks like a domestic cat, just larger in scale. You're looking at a long, including the bobtail there, about 32 inches in size here for the pelt. The speckled, spotted underbelly of the bobcat, and of course the characteristic bobtail. You have to watch in the contest, though. If he were to give you bobcat, they may tuck the tail in under the pelt, so it's not as obvious. So always look for any of the color patterns. The bobcat skull is up to around 4 inches long. It's more rounded on top. Notice the pointed canine teeth at the beginning of the skull and the pointed molars. So we know that the bobcat does eat meat. It's a carnivore. The rounded shape is very similar in shape to the domestic cat skull. And so this kind of rounded, almost fist-sized, fist-shaped skull is one you're going to use for the bobcat. Common muskrat. When I think of common muskrat, I almost think of it like as a smaller version of the American beaver. They're very similar in their characteristics. It's just the muskrat is on a smaller scale. And so as you look at the pelt of the muskrat, you can see it's only about 12 inches, so it's about the size of a sheet of paper. If you feel of the muskrat pelt, it's going to feel very similar to the beaver. They're going to have that outer, more sleek coat, that inner, more fluffy undercoat, because of the aquatic habitat that the muskrat lives in. So it's going to be the small puddle, if you want to think about it that way. If the beaver's a large puddle, the muskrat's the small puddle. The muskrat skull looks very similar to the beaver, only it is 2 inches instead of 4 to 5 inches. Very similar with that angular shape to it, the long incisors and the flat molars. So if it is very similar to beaver, but it's on the small scale, you're going to say it's common muskrat. The track is also very similar. This track is only around 2.5 inches long. But there will be some webbing a little bit to the toes of the muskrat, once again because of the aquatic habitat in which it lives. Let's look at the coyote now. The coyote is a very large pelt. You can see just the body of this, if you take out the tail and the nose, just the body is about 3 feet long. That's a yardstick laying there next to the pelt. Coyote fur is going to feel very similar to dog fur, to kind of give you an idea. Kind of the grayish color of this. Very large animal. When we look at the skull of the coyote, one of our larger skulls, almost 7 inches long. Look at those very large canine teeth pointed down, pointed incisors in the front. This one is very easy to see the pointed shape of the molars. So we know that this animal does eat meat because of the shape of the teeth. The eye socket clearly points forward. We know it's a predator. Another distinctive characteristic of the coyote skull is if you look at the rear of the skull, you're going to see kind of a little almost fin or tail shape to it there at the top of the skull at the rear. And that's another indicator of a coyote skull. Eastern cottontail. So a cottontail pelt, I'm sorry this doesn't have a measurement with it, is going to be quite small. And you've probably seen some of these little pelts at a craft store because you can buy the fur. And so we're thinking smaller than a piece of paper, okay? That's kind of the size we're thinking about with a cottontail. Very soft to the touch, very fluffy. If you've ever petted someone's pet rabbit, you kind of get the idea. The skull of the eastern cottontail is very triangular in shape. And if you think about the cottontail's actual head, it does have a very triangular head. The eyes are set to the side, that way it can see and be on the lookout for danger from predators. You can see the sharp incisors, but look at the molars, they are very flatter, indicating that we're cutting plants with our incisors and grinding on them with our molars. The skull itself is around 3 inches, and like I said, it's very triangular in shape, similar to the head. The track is going to be a long track. We know this is the rear foot of the cottontail, about 3.5 inches long and very narrow. So you think about as that cottontail lays its rear feet down and pushes off as it hops away, that's the track you're looking at there. Let's look at eastern gray squirrel. So this is one that it's hard to find information on. So I did find a photo of a pelt. We know that eastern gray squirrels are quite abundant, kind of smallish to medium size. It depends on how you see your squirrels and if they're rating your bird feeders, right? So kind of that grayish brown color to the pelt there. The gray squirrel skull is very small in size. You're talking about a 2-inch, 2.5 inches at the most size to it. Notice the eye sockets there to the side. Notice the large incisors, the really tiny molars. So think about the gray squirrel diet. And a gray squirrel track is going to be small as well. So when you're thinking about these animals, everything is in proportion. And so the squirrel track is just a little over 2 inches long there. Clearly defined toes, because think about how they can run up the trees, run through parks, your yard, quite agile with their feet. Up next is our gray fox. And so gray fox is going to be similar looking to our coyote, similar textured fur to the pelt, but the size difference is quite a bit. Your gray fox here is a smaller pelt, very long tail, going to be a little fluffier and softer on the underbelly of the fur on the pelt. The gray fox skull is kind of a medium-sized skull for our contest. It's about 4 inches long, more a little bit flatter than maybe you're looking at the coyote skull. Those are kind of similar. You may get those mixed up. It does have the sharp incisors, the long canine teeth there, the pointed molars. One thing you'll notice about the top of the gray fox skull is kind of that little raised path down the center. And so if you're looking at that gray fox skull, a lot of times you'll hear people say gray has a way. And that's the little path along the top of the skull that will help you identify the gray fox skull. Up next we have our mink. And mink and river otter are very similar as well. So if you can kind of group those together, it'll help you study. Mink is a long tubey animal. You can see from the size there, including the tail, it's about 2 feet long. And so you may want to say that the mink body would be like from your fingertips to your elbow. That's kind of tubey shape of your arm and that length. Very soft. At one time, people did make expensive fur coats out of mink. You'll notice that since it has a long tubey body, it has a longer, flatter skull too. The mink skull is about 2 inches. You can see the incisors, the canine teeth pointed there, pointed shape to the molars, but the big identifying characteristic is the size and the shape. It is 2 inches and it's really flat. One of the flattest skulls that we have is our mink skull. Let's look at our raccoon now. Raccoons are quite common. Most of us know them from people wearing raccoon skin hats, right? Old Davy Crockett had one. And so the ringtail is quite the identifying characteristic. Once again, you have to watch in a contest. If he were to give you a raccoon, they may tuck the tail under. And so you're just looking at the body for identifying characteristics. Kind of a stiffer fur, kind of feels, once again, like your dog fur. The raccoon, has the mask across the face. As we look at the skull, it's going to be a little similar to some of the other ones, but it's a little smaller. So to me, it is smaller and not as round as our bobcat, and it's not as long looking as maybe our fox or our coyote. So you can tell here it's 3.5 to 4 inches. It does have the pointed incisors and canines there. Eye sockets more toward the front, so it's kind of rounded, but not as round as a bobcat. And so raccoon skull can be a little confusing. Raccoon tracks, that's the track we showed you in the beginning. To me, they look like a baby footprint. If you've ever seen like your siblings or relatives' little baby feet prints, or even your own, that's kind of what it looks like. And you think about how agile and they move around a lot and can grip with their feet and their toes. And so it kind of makes sense that that looks more like almost human-like. Up next is our river otter. And river otter is going to be very similar to the mink in the shape of it. Long, tubey animal. So if the mink is maybe fingertip to elbow, the river otter would be the length of your arm or even longer. So we're thinking about a really long, tubey animal. Real sleek fur. Think about having that coat that's adaptable for water. When we look at the river otter skull, it looks very similar to the mink, only the size. So instead of the mink being about 2 inches long, now you have a river otter skull that's about 4 inches long. But notice the flatness of it. Very similar as the mink, but the river otter is a larger skull. 4 inches, flatness to it. So your long tubey animals are going to have more of the flat skulls. And our final animal we're going to look at is our white-tailed deer. Very common. Most of us, I'm sure all of us, have seen a deer out at some point in time. The hide for the deer is quite large, depending on the deer, right? So you can kind of see the yardstick there for reference. Kind of feels tougher, real kind of short, stiff, coarse hair on there. The skull I showed you in the very beginning was the white-tailed deer skull. It is the largest skull on our mammal list, and your skull up to 10 to 12 inches in size here. Large eye socket to the side. You can see those very small flat incisors, more grinding molars. Very similar to maybe a horse or a cow skull if you're looking at it. Deer tracks are going to be quite easy to identify. You think about our mammals, we've been looking at a lot of feet, and now with our deer, we're looking at a hoof print. And so just kind of keep that in mind. So hopefully this video will help you to study the mammals for our 4-H wildlife judging competition. And feel free to review this, or if you have questions, reach out and we'll be glad to help.